Picture this. You're a peasant in medieval England, year 1347. You wake up before dawn in a cramped, dirt-floored hut that you share with your family. A few chickens, and probably some rats. You own nothing, not the land you work, not the tools you use, not even the clothes on your back. Your Lord owns everything, including you. You'll work his fields until your hands bleed, harvest his crops until your back breaks, and hand over most of what you grow just for the privilege of staying alive another day. Your children will do the same. Their children will do the same. This is the natural order of things, blessed by God himself, and it will never, ever change. Except it's about to change in the most dramatic and terrifying way imaginable. Because something is coming. Something that will kill one out of every 3 people you know, topple kingdoms, and shatter the very foundations of medieval society. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The survivors, the ordinary peasants and serfs who lived through this nightmare, are about to become the most powerful people in Europe. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's greatest paradoxes. How the deadliest pandemic in human history accidentally created the first great workers' revolution. How death itself became the liberator of the poor. And how in just a few short years, the lowest rung of medieval society would rise up, storm the capital, execute archbishops and force kings to their knees. This isn't just another plague story. This is the story of how the Black Death turned serfs into rebels, slaves into negotiators, and the powerless into the most feared force in medieval Europe. So settle in, because we're about to witness the birth of people power in its rawest, most revolutionary form. Before we dive into the chaos, let me paint you a picture of just how rigid and hopeless life was for the average person in medieval Europe before 1347. The Fute just andal system was an economic arrangement. It was a divine hierarchy, supposedly ordained by God himself, that trapped people in their social class from birth to death with absolutely no hope of escape. At the very top sat the king, who claimed to own every single piece of land in his realm by divine right. Below him were the nobles, lords and dukes who received massive estates as gifts for their loyalty and military service. And at the very bottom, making up roughly 90% of the population, were the serfs. These weren't just poor farmers. They were essentially slaves, legally bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission, unable to marry without approval, unable to own property or learn to read or improve their station in any meaningful way. Here's how the system worked, and why it was so brilliantly oppressive. A serf would wake up each morning and work his lord's fields using his lord's tools. He'd plant crops, tend livestock, repair buildings, and perform whatever back-breaking labour was demanded of him. In return, he got a small plot of land to grow food for his own family, a leaky hut to sleep in, and the lord's protection from bandits and rival armies. But here's the catch. The serf had to give his lord the best portion of everything he produced. The finest grain, the fattest livestock, the choicest fruits and vegetables. What was left over barely kept his family alive through the winter months. And if the harvest was bad, if disease struck the crops or raider serfs starved while dined on their lords burned the fields, the Ser imported delicacies in their stone castles. Even worse, serfs were legally forbidden from leaving their lord's estate. They were tied to the land like trees, rooted in place by law and tradition. If a serf tried to run away to find better conditions elsewhere, he could be hunted down like a criminal, dragged back in chains, and punished severely. His children inherited this bondage. His children's children would inherit it too. There was no escape, no hope of advancement, no way to break free from this cycle of exploitation. The nobles justified this system with a beautiful piece of propaganda they called the 3 orders of society. They claimed that God had divided humanity into 3 distinct groups, each with their own sacred purpose. The priests, or those who pray, handled spiritual matters and maintained the connection to the divine. The nobles, or those who fight, protected society from external threats, and maintained order through their military might. And the peasants, or those who work, provided food and labour to sustain everyone else. This wasn't presented as an economic arrangement or a political choice. It was divine law, as natural and unchangeable as the rising sun or the changing seasons. The nobles told the peasants that their suffering was holy, that their poverty was a test from God, and that accepting their lowly station with patience and humility would earn them rewards in the afterlife. By 1347, this system had been perfected over centuries. Europe was severely overpopulated, with far more people than available land or resources could reasonably support. This created a massive surplus of desperate workers who would accept any conditions just to survive. Lords could treat their serfs horribly, because there were always more hungry families willing to take their place. The result was a society where a tiny elite lived in unimaginable luxury, while the vast majority existed in grinding poverty, generation after generation, with no hope of change. Lords feasted on roasted peacock and fine wine, while their serfs gnawed on black bread and watery gruel. Lords wore silk and velvet, while their serfs shivered in rough wool and animal skins. Lords lived in massive stone castles with glass windows and elaborate furnishings, while their serfs huddled in one-room huts with dirt floors and holes in the roof. And the serfs had no choice but to accept it all, because the alternative was starvation or death. The system was airtight, brutal, and seemingly permanent. The rich got richer, the poor stayed desperately poor, and the wheel of oppression turned endlessly, crushing each new generation under its weight. But in 1347, something started stirring in the crowded, filthy port cities of Europe. Ships were arriving from the east, carrying more than just exotic spices and luxury goods. They were carrying death itself, in the form of infected rats and fleas that would soon unleash the most devastating pandemic in human history. The disease had many names: the Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, the Black Death. Modern historians believe it was primarily bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though some evidence suggests it may have been a combination of multiple diseases working together to create the perfect storm of destruction. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims would develop painful, swollen lumps called buboes in their armpits, neck, and groin. These could grow as large as apples and would often burst, releasing foul-smelling pus and blood. High fever set in, along with chills, vomiting, and severe headaches. Black spots would appear on the skin as blood vessels burst and tissue died. In the final stages, victims would cough up blood and struggle to breathe as their lungs filled with fluid. Most terrifying of all was the speed. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead before sunset. Entire families would be wiped out in a matter of days. Whole villages would be abandoned, their streets littered with rotting corpses that no one dared approach. The plague showed no respect for social boundaries. It killed peasants and kings, priests and sinners, the devout and the wicked with equal enthusiasm. For the first time in medieval history, the rigid hierarchies that defined society meant absolutely nothing. Death was coming for everyone, but was the great equalizer. And here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. While the plague killed people from all social classes, it didn't kill them equally. The nobility, living in their stone castles with better food, cleaner water, and more space between households, had somewhat lower infection rates. They could also afford to flee to remote country estates when plague struck their cities, taking their wealth and servants with them. The peasants and urban poor, however, were sitting ducks. They lived packed together in crowded, unsanitary conditions that were perfect breeding grounds for disease. They shared living spaces with their animals, drank from polluted water sources, and had no resources to flee when the plague arrived. They also had weaker immune systems from years of malnutrition and constant physical stress. As the plague swept across Europe between 1347 and 1353, it killed an estimated 25 million people, roughly 1/3 of the entire population. But among the peasant class, the death toll was often much higher. Some rural areas lost half their population or more. Entire bloodlines were wiped out. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned and slowly reclaimed by forest. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Fields went unharvested as their workers died. Livestock wandered freely as their keepers perished. Mills stood silent as their operators succumbed to disease. The carefully orchestrated system of feudal agriculture, which had fed Europe for centuries, simply collapsed. But then something remarkable happened. The survivors looked around and realized that everything had changed. For the first time in their lives, there weren't enough workers to go around. The lords who had once treated them like disposable property were now desperately competing for their labor. Think about it from an economic perspective. Before the plague, there were far too many workers and not enough jobs. This meant that lords could offer terrible wages and working conditions because desperate people would accept anything. But after the plague killed off 1/3 of the workforce, suddenly there were too many jobs and not enough workers. The economic power dynamic had completely flipped overnight. A serf who had once begged for scraps was now being courted by multiple lords offering better wages, improved living conditions, and actual respect. For the first time in medieval history, common workers had leverage. They could negotiate, they could make demands, they could walk away from bad situations because they knew another employer would snatch them up immediately. The psychological impact was just as important as the economic one. These survivors had lived through the apocalypse and come out the other side. They had watched the old world collapse and die around them. The divine order that had once seemed so permanent and unshakable had been revealed as fragile and temporary. If God could allow such devastation to sweep away kings and commoners alike, maybe the social hierarchy wasn't as sacred as everyone had believed. And so began one of the most dramatic social revolutions in European history. In the space of just a few years, the people who had once been considered the lowest of the low would discover their own power, challenge their oppressors, and completely reshape the society that had ground them down for centuries. The stage was set for an uprising that would shake the foundations of medieval Europe and give birth to ideas about workers' rights, social equality, and political revolution that would echo through the centuries. The serfs were about to become rebels, and nothing would ever be the same again. Let's talk about what happened when surviving peasants first realized they held all the cards. Picture John, a serf who had spent his entire life bowing and scraping before his lord. His father died in the fields, his mother died birthing her 8th child, and John himself had never owned so much as a copper coin. But now, in the summer of 1349, John stood in his lord's hall and did something that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. He looked his master in the eye and said no. The lord had demanded that John work extra days without pay, repair the mill roof, and tend the sheep through the winter months. Standard demands that any serf would have accepted without question in the old world. But John had buried half his village. He'd watched the manor's other workers die one by one until only a handful remained. And he'd noticed something remarkable. The Lord needed him more than he needed the Lord. So John crossed his arms and made a counteroffer. Double wages, a cottage with a real roof instead of thatch, meat twice a week, and Sundays off to tend his own garden plot. The Lord's face went purple with rage. He shouted about divine order and natural hierarchy and the audacity of peasants who forgot their place. But when John turned to leave, heading for the estate down the valley where another desperate lord was offering even better terms, his master's tune changed quickly. This scene played out thousands of times across Europe as surviving workers discovered their newfound bargaining power. Lords who had once ruled through fear and tradition now found themselves competing desperately for labourers. They offered higher wages, better food, improved housing, and actual respect to workers they had previously treated like livestock. The transformation was swift and dramatic. Archaeological evidence shows that peasant households suddenly began using metal cookware instead of cheap clay pots. They wore better clothing, ate finer food, and even began purchasing luxury items that had once been reserved for the wealthy. Wage records from the period show that agricultural workers' pay tripled or even quadrupled in some regions. But the most important change wasn't economic. It was psychological. These survivors had tasted freedom, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. They began to move freely between estates, shopping around for the best deals. They negotiated contracts instead of simply accepting whatever scraps were offered. Some even abandoned agricultural work entirely, heading to cities where skilled craftsmen were desperately needed and wages were even higher. The mobility was revolutionary. For centuries, serfs had been legally bound to their lord's land like property. But now, with workers so scarce and valuable, lords were willing to overlook legal restrictions if it meant keeping their fields productive. A serf could simply pack up his family and walk to another manor, knowing he'd be welcomed with open arms and no questions asked about his legal status. This freedom of movement created a ripple effect throughout medieval society. Villages that had been isolated for generations suddenly found their young people leaving for better opportunities elsewhere. Traditional family structures broke down as daughters left home to work as servants in wealthy households, and sons abandoned their inherited trades to learn new skills in distant towns. The rigid social order that had defined medieval life for centuries began to crack and crumble. Women, in particular, found unprecedented opportunities in this new world. Before the plague, most peasant women were trapped in cycles of childbearing and domestic labour with no chance of economic independence. But the labour shortage created demand for female workers in textile production, domestic service, and even some skilled trades. For the first time, ordinary women could earn their own wages and make their own choices about marriage and family life. The church noticed these changes with growing alarm. Priests complained that peasants were dressing above their station, eating foods once reserved for the wealthy, and worst of all, questioning the divine order that kept society stable. Church records from the period are filled with frustrated sermons about uppity workers who had forgotten their proper place in God's plan. But the peasants weren't just getting richer, they were getting ideas. Dangerous ideas about equality, fairness, and the right to a decent life. These concepts spread through the countryside like wildfire, carried by travelling workers who shared stories of better conditions elsewhere. For the first time in medieval history, common people began to believe that their suffering wasn't divinely ordained, but man-made and therefore changeable. The elite saw what was happening and panicked. The natural order they had used to justify their wealth and power was collapsing before their eyes. Peasants who should have been grateful for any work at all were making demands, setting conditions, and walking away from bad deals. Something had to be done to restore the proper hierarchy before things spiraled completely out of control. Their response was swift and desperate. In England, they passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and legally compel workers to accept the first job offered to them. Similar laws appeared across Europe as terrified nobles tried to use government power to force workers back into submission. The law was breathtakingly arrogant in its scope. It declared that no peasant could demand higher wages than they had received in 1346. It required every able-bodied worker to accept employment from the first employer who demanded their services. It established harsh penalties for workers who tried to move between jobs or negotiate better conditions. And it empowered local magistrates to arrest and punish anyone who violated these restrictions. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The peasants simply ignored these laws. Court records from the period show thousands of cases where workers openly defied the statute, demanded higher wages, abandoned their jobs for better opportunities, and moved freely between employers despite legal prohibitions. Take Edwarilla from the TR, a small village in Wiltshire. In 1352, just 1 year after the statute was passed, Court records show that he left his job with the local abbey before Christmas without permission and contrary to the law. When hauled before a magistrate, Edward showed no remorse. He'd found better work elsewhere and saw no reason why he should have to accept inferior conditions just because some law said so. Or consider the case of John Fisher and his companions from Lincolnshire. In 1374, these 12 workers simply refused to work for their local abbey at the wages demanded by law. When ordered to comply, they packed up and left town to find higher wages elsewhere, openly defying both the statute and royal authority. The court labelled their actions contemptuous, but the workers clearly didn't care what the court thought. These weren't isolated incidents. Court records show hundreds of similar cases across England as workers discovered that laws without enforcement were just words on parchment. Local magistrates found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of violations. Many simply gave up trying to enforce the statute because there were too many lawbreakers and not enough jail cells to hold them all. The futility became clear when employers themselves began violating the law. Lords and abbots who publicly supported wage controls were secretly offering higher pay to attract workers. They had no choice. Fields full of rotting grain and empty stables weren't going to maintain themselves, and workers had made it clear they wouldn't accept pre-plague wages no matter what the law said. Meanwhile, the social changes accelerated. Peasants who had never owned anything more valuable than a wooden spoon were suddenly purchasing items that declared their rising status to the world. They bought better clothes, finer food, and even small luxuries that had once been exclusively aristocratic. Archaeological evidence from peasant households shows a dramatic increase in quality goods during this period, from metal cookware to glass vessels to imported spices. The clothing changes were particularly visible and particularly infuriating to the upper classes. Peasants began wearing bright colours, finer fabrics, and fashionable styles that made it difficult to distinguish them from their social betters at a distance. This violated one of the most fundamental principles of medieval society, which relied on visual cues to maintain social hierarchy. The response was another set of desperate laws called sumptuary legislation. These laws attempted to regulate what different social classes could wear, eat, and purchase based on their birth status rather than their wealth. In England, Parliament decreed that labourers could only wear rough cloth and rabbit fur, while merchants were restricted to slightly better materials, and only nobles could wear silk, velvet, and expensive furs like sable. But like the wage controls, these laws proved impossible to enforce. How do you stop a wealthy peasant from buying silk when merchants are eager to sell it to anyone with coin? How do you identify someone's birth status when they're dressed as well as minor nobility? The old visual markers of class distinction began to blur as economic power shifted. The psychological impact of these changes rippled through medieval society like an earthquake. For the first time in centuries, the connection between birth and destiny had been severed. A peasant's son could realistically aspire to wealth, education, and social mobility. A serf's daughter could choose her own husband and live independently. The rigid caste system that had defined European civilization was cracking apart, and into this volatile mixture of economic opportunity, social upheaval, and legal resistance stepped a radical priest named John Ball, who would give these scattered grievances a voice, a theology, and ultimately a call to revolution that would shake the very foundations of medieval England. John Ball wasn't your typical medieval priest. While most clergymen of his era preached about accepting one's divinely appointed station in life, Ball stood in village squares and market towns delivering sermons that turned traditional theology on its head. His message was simple, radical, and absolutely explosive in the context of 14th century England. All people, he declared, were born equal in the eyes of God. Ball had been spreading this dangerous gospel since at least 1360, travelling from town to town without a permanent parish or any official backing from church hierarchy. He was what you might call a freelance revolutionary, using biblical scripture to challenge the very foundations of feudal society. his most famous sermon question became a rallying cry that would echo through the centuries. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Think about how radical this question was in medieval context. Ball was essentially asking his audiences to imagine the Garden of Eden, where the first humans worked the soil with their own hands. Adam dug in the dirt, Eve spun thread, and there were no lords or ladies, no nobles or serfs, no elaborate hierarchies of birth and blood. If God had created all humans equal in paradise, Ball argued, then the social divisions that dominated medieval life were man-made constructions, not divine commandments. This wasn't just theological speculation. Ball was providing a religious framework for the anger and frustration that had been building among the common people since the Black Death. The peasants who had discovered their economic power now heard a priest telling them they also had spiritual equality. Their suffering wasn't holy, their poverty wasn't ordained by God. The lords who exploited them weren't divinely appointed rulers, but fellow humans who had simply grabbed power and refused to let go. Ball's sermons drew massive crowds wherever he went. Word spread through the countryside that a priest was finally speaking truths that ordinary people had felt in their hearts, but never heard from a pulpit. He preached in Ashen, Billericay, Bocking, Braintree, and dozens of other villages across Essex and Kent. Everywhere he went, he left behind communities buzzing with dangerous new ideas about equality, justice, and the rights of common people. The church authorities were horrified. Here was one of their own priests using Christian doctrine to undermine the social order that medieval kept society stable. They tried to silence Ball through official channels, imprisoning him multiple times and forbidding him from preaching. But each time he was released or escaped, he returned to his circuit of revolutionary sermons with renewed energy and larger audiences. Ball's theology was particularly powerful because it flipped traditional Christian teaching about poverty and suffering. Instead of telling the poor that their hardships would be rewarded in heaven, he suggested that God intended for all people to share equally in earthly prosperity. Instead of preaching patience and submission, he encouraged resistance and rebellion against unjust authority. This message found especially fertile ground among the peasants who had lived through the plague years. They had seen the old certainties crumble. They had watched lords beg for their labour. They had tasted economic freedom and weren't about to give it back without a fight. Ball gave them the theological ammunition they needed to justify their growing defiance. But it wasn't just Ball's preaching that was radicalizing the countryside. The economic and social changes triggered by the plague were creating friction at every level of society. The government's desperate attempts to control wages and maintain the old hierarchies were backfiring spectacularly, creating resentment and resistance that grew stronger with each passing year. By the late 1370s, England was facing a perfect storm of social tensions. The ongoing war with France was draining the royal treasury and requiring ever higher taxes from an already struggling population. The church was losing credibility as corrupt officials accumulated vast wealth while preaching poverty to others. The nobility was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their traditional lifestyle as peasant wages rose and agricultural profits fell. And then came the final insult that would push the common people over the edge into open rebellion. In 1377, Parliament introduced something called a poll tax, a flat fee that every person over the age of 15 had to pay regardless of their income or social status. This wasn't a tax on property or wealth, which would have fallen primarily on the rich. It was a tax on existence itself, and it hit the poor just as hard as the wealthy. The poll tax violated every principle of fairness that medieval people understood. Traditional taxes were based on ability to pay, with the wealthy contributing more and the poor contributing less or nothing at all. But the poll tax demanded the same payment from a prosperous merchant and a struggling farm labourer, from lord and a powerful-less peasant. The first poll tax of 1377 caused grumbling but was mostly paid. The second tax in 1379 led to more widespread resistance. But when Parliament imposed a third poll tax in 1380, raising the amount to 3 times the original level, the patience of the common people finally snapped. Tax collectors travelling through Essex and Kent found themselves facing increasingly hostile receptions. In some villages, they were simply told that no one could afford to pay. In others, they were met with outright defiance and threats. The government's response was to send in commissioners with broader powers to investigate non-payment and force compliance through intimidation and punishment. This heavy-handed approach proved to be the spark that ignited 4 decades of accumulated resentment into open flames. On May 30th, 1381, a particularly brutal commissioner named Thomas Bampton arrived in the Essex village of Fobbing to investigate why the local residents hadn't paid their poll tax. What happened next would change English history forever. The villagers of Fobbing had clearly had enough. They weren't going to be bullied by another government official demanding money they didn't have for a war they didn't support. Led by a local landowner named Thomas Baker, they physically threw Bampton out of their village and told him not to come back. When news of this defiance reached London, the 15-year-old King Richard II sent soldiers to restore order and arrest the ringleaders. But when the royal troops arrived in Fobbing, the villagers treated them exactly the same way they had treated the tax commissioner. They were outnumbered, outraged, and sent packing with their tails between their legs. Word of Fobbing's successful resistance spread like wildfire through the surrounding countryside. If one small village could defy royal authority and get away with it, why couldn't others? Within days, similar uprisings erupted across Essex and Kent, as communities that had been pushed to their breaking point finally decided to push back. But these weren't random acts of violence or mindless destruction. The rebels showed remarkable organisation and discipline from the very beginning. They had clear political goals, sophisticated communication networks, and strategic thinking that suggested careful planning, rather than spontaneous rage. Their first priority was freeing John Ball from his prison cell in Maidstone Castle. The radical priest had become a symbol of resistance and a source of inspiration for the growing movement. A large group of rebels marched on Maidstone, overwhelmed the castle's defences, and liberated Ball to thunderous cheers from his supporters. With their spiritual leader free, the rebels began organising themselves into a proper army. They elected captains, established supply lines, and developed a coordinated strategy for their march on London. This wasn't a mob of angry peasants running wild. This was a disciplined revolutionary force with specific demands and clear objectives. The rebels' choice of leader revealed just how much medieval society had changed since the plague. They didn't elect a noble or a knight or someone with traditional claims to authority. Instead, they chose Wat Tyler, a former soldier from Kent who had no aristocratic blood but possessed the practical leadership skills they needed. Tyler was everything the old feudal system said a leader shouldn't be. He was common-born, rough-spoken, and completely unimpressed by traditional hierarchy. But he had military experience, organisational ability, and most importantly, the trust of his fellow rebels. In the new world emerging from the ashes of the plague, competence mattered more than bloodline. Under Tyler's leadership, the rebel army grew rapidly as they marched through the countryside toward London. They weren't just angry peasants anymore. They were joined by skilled craftsmen, minor merchants, parish priests, and even some members of the lesser nobility who had grown disgusted with royal corruption and mismanagement. The rebels' message resonated far beyond the rural villages where the movement had started. Urban workers who faced their own struggles with wage controls and guild restrictions saw common cause with the agricultural labourers. Small landowners who were being squeezed by rising taxes and falling prices joined the march. Even some members of the lower clergy, inspired by John Ball's radical theology, threw their support behind the uprising. As the rebel army approached London in mid-June 1381, they numbered thousands. They'd in the tens had transformed from a local tax revolt into a genuine popular revolution that threatened to overthrow the entire political and social order of medieval England. The established authorities were caught completely off guard. The king was just 14 years old and surrounded by advisors who had no idea how to handle a situation like this. The royal army was mostly fighting in France, leaving London defended by a skeleton force that was vastly outnumbered by the approaching rebels. The nobility, who had spent decades dismissing peasant complaints as irrelevant, suddenly found themselves facing an organized, determined, and very angry popular uprising. And the rebels had one crucial advantage that their rulers hadn't anticipated. They had friends inside the city. London's own working population had watched the rural uprising with growing excitement and sympathy. When Wat Tyler's army reached the capital, they found the city gates mysteriously left open and crowds of supporters waiting to welcome them. For the first time in English history, the common people had seized control of the nation's capital. Lords and bishops fled for their lives as rebels poured through the streets, settling scores with corrupt officials and destroying symbols of oppression that had ground them down for generations. The impossible was happening. The lowest members of medieval society had risen up and taken power from their supposed betters. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, events would unfold that would forever change the relationship between rulers and ruled in medieval Europe. The rebels were about to discover both the intoxicating power of revolution and its terrible costs. The gates of London stood wide open on June 13th, 1381, and through them poured the largest popular uprising England had ever seen. But this wasn't a mindless mob seeking random destruction. These rebels had a hit list, and they knew exactly where to find their targets. Picture the scene as thousands of armed peasants, craftsmen and labourers flooded through the streets of medieval London. They moved with purpose, bypassing ordinary citizens and heading straight for the symbols of their oppression. Their first stop was the Savoy Palace, the magnificent riverside mansion of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and one of the most hated men in England. John of Gaunt represented everything the rebels despised about the corrupt ruling class. He was fabulously wealthy, while ordinary people starved. He had pushed for the hated poll tax while exempting himself and his noble friends from its burden. He lived in luxury while his policies ground the common people into poverty. And now, his palace was about to pay the price. The rebels didn't just ransack the Savoy Palace. They systematically destroyed it, room by room, with an almost ritualistic precision that revealed the depth of their anger. They hauled expensive furniture into the courtyard and burned it in massive bonfires. They smashed priceless art and threw gold and silver objects into the Thames rather than stealing them. They wanted to make a statement that this wasn't about personal enrichment. This was about justice. One rebel was actually executed by his own comrades for trying to pocket a silver cup during the destruction. The message was clear. They weren't thieves or common criminals. They were revolutionaries fighting for principles, not profit. Every tapestry they burned, every jewel they threw in the river, every piece of fine furniture they smashed was a declaration that the old world of aristocratic privilege was ending. But the rebels saved their real fury for the lawyers and clerks who had enforced the system that oppressed them. These weren't the glamorous nobles who lived in castles and fought in tournaments. These were the bureaucrats, the record keepers, the men who tracked down runaway serfs and enforced wage controls and collected the hated taxes that funded endless foreign wars. The rebels hunted down legal documents wherever they could find them. They broke into government offices, private law practices, and monastery scriptoriums, gathering up centuries of legal records and feeding them to the flames. Contracts that bound serfs to their lords, court records that had been used to prosecute workers who demanded fair wages, tax rolls that documented who owed what to whom, all of it went into the fire. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a surgical strike against the paperwork apparatus that held the feudal system together. The rebels understood something modern that people often forget. In medieval society, your legal status wasn't just a matter of birth. It was documented, recorded, and enforced through an elaborate system of written records. Burn the documents, and you could literally erase the legal foundation's earthdom. The symbolic power of this document burning cannot be overstated. For centuries, these papers had been weapons used against the common people. A lord could point to a charter and claim ownership of a village. A tax collector could consult his rolls and demand payment from families who could barely afford food. A judge could check court records and sentence a runaway serf to punishment. But now, watching these documents turn to ash, the rebels were witnessing the destruction of the very system that had kept them in chains. Meanwhile, other groups of rebels were pursuing more personal forms of justice. They had a clear list of individuals they held responsible for their suffering, and they methodically hunted down these targets throughout the city. Their primary objective was the Tower of London, where several of the most hated government officials had taken refuge. The tower should have been impregnable. It was England's most formidable fortress, designed to withstand armies and sieges. It held the royal treasury, the crown jewels, and was defended by 600 professional soldiers. But when the rebels arrived at its gates, something extraordinary happened. The garrison simply refused to fight. Think about what this meant. These weren't foreign invaders or rival nobles seeking to steal the crown. These were English peasants and craftsmen, the very people the soldiers were supposed to protect according to the feudal contract. Many of the garrison were commoners themselves, men who had family and friends among the rebels. When ordered to fire on their own countrymen, they laid down their weapons instead. The tower's gates swung open without a battle, and the rebels poured inside to claim their prizes. They weren't interested in the gold or jewels housed there. They wanted 3 specific men who had come to symbolize everything wrong with English government. Simon Sudbury was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious official in England and one of the architects of the poll tax. To the rebels, he represented the corrupt church hierarchy that preached poverty while accumulating vast wealth. Robert Hales was the king's treasurer, the man directly responsible for collecting the taxes that had pushed so many families to the brink of starvation. John Lager was a tax commissioner, one of the brutal enforcers who had terrorized villages across England in pursuit of poll tax payments. The rebels dragged these 3 men from their hiding places and executed them on Tower Hill with swift, brutal efficiency. But they didn't stop there. They cut off the heads of their victims and mounted them on poles, then paraded through the streets of London as crowds of supporters cheered and celebrated. This wasn't mindless bloodlust. It was political theatre of the highest order. For centuries, the heads of executed rebels and criminals had been displayed on spikes as warnings to anyone who might challenge royal authority. Now the tables were turned. The rebels were putting the heads of corrupt officials on display as a warning to anyone who might oppress the common people. The psychological impact was devastating for the ruling class. These weren't distant peasants in remote villages anymore. These were organized revolutionaries who had penetrated the heart of royal power, overwhelmed England's most secure fortress, and executed high-ranking officials with complete impunity. If they could reach the Archbishop of Canterbury in the Tower of London, they could reach anyone, anywhere. But even in their moment of triumph, the rebels showed remarkable restraint. They could have massacred every noble in London. They could have looted the royal treasury and the crown jewels. They could have burned down every church and government building in the city. Instead, they maintained discipline and focused on their specific political objectives. Their real goal wasn't destruction or revenge. It was negotiation. They wanted to meet with King Richard II himself and present their demands for fundamental changes to English society. They believed that if they could just speak directly to the king, away from his corrupt advisors, they could convince him to abolish serfdom, end wage controls, and create a more just society for the common people. This faith in the king's basic goodness reveals something touching about the rebels' worldview. They didn't see themselves as enemies of the monarchy or opponents of legitimate authority. They saw themselves as loyal subjects who were trying to rescue their young king from the corrupt nobles and officials who surrounded him. In their minds, Richard II was as much a victim of the system as they were. On June 14th, 1381, this extraordinary meeting actually took place. King Richard II, just 14 years old and accompanied by a small group of advisors, rode out to meet the rebel army at Mile End, a field outside London's walls. It was one of the most remarkable confrontations in medieval history. A teenage king facing thousands of armed peasants in direct negotiation. Wat Tyler stepped forward as the rebels' spokesman and presented their demands with the confidence of a man who held all the cards. They wanted an end to serfdom throughout England. They wanted the right to buy and sell goods freely without guild restrictions. They wanted rent limits of 4 pence per acre to prevent landlords from gouging tenants. They wanted a general pardon for all participants in the rebellion. And they wanted the removal of corrupt officials who had oppressed the common people. These weren't the desperate pleas of defeated subjects begging for mercy. These were the demands of a victorious army dictating terms to a conquered enemy. And astonishingly, the young king agreed to everything. He promised to abolish serfdom, grant free trade, limit rents, and pardon all the rebels. He even agreed to provide them with royal charters documenting these concessions so they would have legal proof of his promises. The rebels could hardly believe their success. In just a few days, they had achieved what centuries of patient suffering had failed to accomplish. They had forced the King of England to abolish the entire feudal system and grant them the freedoms their ancestors had never dared to dream of. Many of the rebels, satisfied with these royal promises, began the journey home to D towns. They carried with them copies of their villages and of the King's Charter and stories of their incredible victory. For the first time in English history, the common people had faced down royal authority and won everything they had demanded. But Wat Tyler and a core group of followers remained in London. They suspected, correctly, that the king's advisors would try to convince him to break his promises once the immediate threat had passed. They wanted additional guarantees and more specific commitments about how these reforms would be implemented. Tyler requested another meeting with the king, this time at Smithfield, a large open area just outside the city walls where livestock markets were normally held. It seemed appropriate somehow. The rebels who had once been treated like animals would meet their king in a place where cattle and sheep were bought and sold. But this second meeting would have a very different outcome than the first. The royal advisors had spent the night plotting to regain control of the situation, and they were prepared to use any means necessary to break the power of the rebellion. What happened next at Smithfield would determine not just the fate of Wat Tyler and his remaining followers, but the entire future of social reform in medieval England. The rebels had achieved the impossible by forcing a king to abolish serfdom and grant them unprecedented freedoms. But holding on to those gains would prove to be much more difficult than winning them in the first place. The young king rode into Smithfield on June 15th with a much larger entourage than he had brought to Mile End. This time, he was surrounded by armed knights and royal officials who had no intention of making further concessions to the rebels. The mood was tense as Tyler approached to continue the negotiations that had seemed so promising just one day earlier. What followed was a tragedy that would echo through English history for centuries. During the heated discussion, William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, suddenly drew his dagger and struck Tyler down. Some accounts claim Tyler had been disrespectful to the king. Others suggest he had reached for his own weapon. But the truth hardly mattered. The rebels' leader lay dying in the dust, and their moment of triumph was turning into disaster. The remaining rebels, seeing their leader murdered before their eyes, raised their bows and prepared to fight to the death. For a few terrifying moments, it seemed that Smithfield would become a massacre that would drench the field in blood. But then something remarkable happened. The 14-year-old king spurred his horse forward, rode directly toward the angry crowd, and shouted words that would be remembered for generations. "I am your king," Richard declared. "Follow me." And incredibly they did. The rebels, leaderless and confused, allowed themselves to be led away from the field by the very monarch they had been negotiating with just moments before. It was a masterstroke of political theatre that probably saved hundreds of lives and certainly changed the course of the rebellion. But the king's dramatic gesture at Smithfield was just the beginning of a systematic campaign to reverse every concession that had been granted to the rebels. Once Tyler was dead and the rebel army had been dispersed, the royal advisors moved quickly to restore the old order and punish those who had dared to challenge it. The promises made at Mile End were declared invalid because, the government claimed, they had been extracted under duress. The royal charters granting freedom to the serfs were recalled and destroyed. The pardons were revoked, and royal commissioners were sent throughout the countryside to hunt down and execute the rebellion's leaders. The backlash was swift and brutal. Hundreds of rebels were hanged, drawn and quartered, or subjected to other forms of public execution designed to terrorize anyone who might consider following their example. John Ball, the radical priest whose sermons had helped inspire the uprising, was captured and executed with particular cruelty as an example of what happened to those who used religion to challenge political authority. Village after village that had supported the rebellion found itself facing royal punishment. Heavy fines were imposed on entire communities. Local leaders were arrested and executed. The legal documents that rebels had burned were painstakingly reconstructed from copies held in other locations. Within months, it seemed as if the Great Uprising of 1381 had been completely crushed and its achievements entirely erased. But appearances can be deceiving. While the immediate political gains of the rebellion were reversed, the deeper changes it represented could not be undone so easily. The plague had fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval society, and no amount of royal decree could bring back the dead workers whose labour had once been so cheap and abundant. The economic realities that had empowered the rebels in the first place remained unchanged. There still weren't enough workers to go around. Wages still had to be higher than pre-plague levels, or the crops would rot in the fields. Serfs could still walk away from bad situations because other employers were desperate for their labour. The feudal system might have survived the rebellion, but it was a hollow shell of its former self. More importantly, the rebellion had shattered forever the mystique of royal and noble authority. The common people had seen that kings could be forced to negotiate, that nobles could be made to flee in terror, and that the supposedly divine order of medieval society was actually quite fragile when challenged by organized popular resistance. The memory of those few glorious days when peasants and craftsmen had controlled London, dictated terms to the king, and briefly held the power to reshape English society would inspire future generations of rebels and reformers. The specific demands of 1381 might have been defeated, but the precedent had been set. The common people had tasted power, and they would never completely forget what it felt like. In villages across England, old men would tell their grandchildren about the time when Wat Tyler and his followers had made the king himself bow to their demands. In market towns, craftsmen would whisper about the day when royal charters had promised to abolish serfdom forever. In parish churches, despite official disapproval, people would remember John Ball's radical sermons about the equality of all human beings in God's eyes. The rebellion of 1381 had failed in its immediate objectives, but it had succeeded in something more important. It had proven that change was possible, that the seemingly permanent structures of medieval oppression could be challenged, and that ordinary people had the power to reshape their world if they could find the courage to act together. The Black Death had given the poor their first taste of economic power. The failed rebellion had taught them about the possibilities and perils of political power. Neither lesson would be forgotten as medieval society slowly evolved into something that would eventually recognize, however imperfectly, the rights and dignity of common people. The serfs had become rebels, if only for a brief moment, but that moment had changed everything, even if it would take centuries for the full implications to become clear. The seeds of modern democracy, workers' rights, and social equality had been planted in the blood-soaked fields of medieval England, watered by the tears of defeated peasants who had dared to dream of a better world. The aftermath of 1381 didn't end the story of how plague transformed medieval society. It simply marked the beginning of a longer, more complex revolution that would unfold over decades. While the dramatic rebellion had been crushed, the economic and social forces unleashed by the Black Death continued to reshape Europe in ways that no king or parliament could control. Think about what happened in the months and years following Wat Tyler's death. The royal commissioners, who had been sent to restore order, quickly discovered that executing rebel leaders was much easier than solving the fundamental problems that had caused the uprising in the first place. You could hang 100 peasant organizers, but you couldn't hang your way back to a world where workers were desperate enough to accept starvation wages. The labor shortage remained as acute as ever. Fields still needed to be planted and harvested. Animals still needed to be tended. Mills still needed to be operated. And there simply weren't enough people to do all this work at the artificially low wages that the government was trying to enforce. Economic reality had a way of making royal decrees irrelevant. Local records from across England tell the story of what really happened once the initial panic of the rebellion had subsided. Landlords who had publicly supported the brutal suppression of the rebels were quietly offering higher wages and better conditions to attract workers. Abbots, who had demanded harsh punishment for rebellious serfs, were secretly negotiating individual deals to keep their most valuable labourers from walking away. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also inevitable. A lord could proclaim his loyalty to traditional hierarchy all he wanted, but if his grain rotted in the fields because he couldn't find workers at legal wages, his noble principles wouldn't pay his debts or feed his household. Survival trumped ideology every time. Take the case of the Abbey of St. Albans, one of the wealthiest religious institutions in England. The abbot had been one of the most vocal supporters of crushing the rebellion and restoring the old order. He had publicly celebrated the execution of local rebel leaders and demanded that all serfs return to their traditional obligations without question or compensation. But privately, the abbey's account books tell a different story. Within months of the rebellion's defeat, the monks were paying agricultural workers nearly double the legal wage rates. They were offering free housing, better food, and even small cash bonuses to prevent their labourers from seeking employment elsewhere. The gap between public rhetoric and private practice revealed just how hollow the supposed restoration of royal authority really was. This pattern repeated itself across the countryside. Court records show that prosecutions for wage violations actually increased after 1381, not because workers were becoming more rebellious, but because employers were becoming more desperate. The same local magistrates who had condemned rebel wage demands were now quietly ignoring similar violations by the very landlords who employed them. The government's attempts to restore legal serfdom proved equally futile. On paper, the royal charters promising freedom had been revoked, and the old bonds of feudal obligation had been restored. But in practice, it became nearly impossible to enforce these legal restrictions when workers had so many alternatives available to them. Consider what happened when a lord tried to prevent a serf from leaving his estate. In the old days, before the plague, this had been relatively simple. The serf had nowhere else to go because every lord had plenty of workers and no incentive to harbour runaways. But after 1381, a fleeing serf could walk to the next village and find immediate employment at better wages than his original master had been offering. Even if the runaway was caught and dragged back to face punishment, the problem wasn't solved. You could fine a serf for attempting to leave, but you couldn't force him to work productively if he didn't want to. A discontented worker could sabotage equipment, neglect livestock, or simply work so slowly and carelessly that his labor became worthless. The threat of punishment only worked if the worker cared more about avoiding pain than about gaining freedom. The psychological transformation was just as important as the economic one. The generation that had lived through the rebellion had seen their supposed betters revealed as frightened, desperate, and ultimately powerless when confronted by organized popular resistance. The mystique of noble authority had been shattered in ways that no amount of royal propaganda could repair. Young people who had grown up hearing stories about Wat Tyler and John Ball weren't impressed by threats about divine punishment for challenging the social order. They had been told that the rebellion was a sinful defiance of God's will, but they could see with their own eyes that the rebels' economic demands were being quietly accepted, even as their political leaders were being executed. The church found itself in a particularly awkward position. Officially, the clergy continued to preach about accepting one's divinely appointed station in life and the wickedness of social rebellion. But many parish priests were themselves from common backgrounds and sympathetic to their parishioners' struggles. Some had even supported the uprising, despite the risks to their careers and lives. These local clergymen faced a constant tension between official doctrine and pastoral reality. They were supposed to tell their congregations that seeking higher wages was sinful greed, but they could see that these same wages were necessary for families to survive. They were supposed to condemn social equality as heretical, but they served communities where traditional hierarchies were breaking down every day. The result was a kind of theological guerrilla warfare, where radical ideas continued to spread through unofficial channels, even as they were being suppressed through official ones. Sermons might officially endorse traditional hierarchy, but private conversations after Mass often focused on the practical benefits of labour organisation and collective bargaining. Meanwhile, the economic changes accelerated rather than slowed in the aftermath of the rebellion. The plague hadn't finished with Europe yet. Smaller outbreaks continued to occur every few years, preventing the population from recovering to pre-1347 levels. Each new wave of disease meant fewer workers and more leverage for the survivors. Archaeological evidence from this period shows continued improvement in peasant living standards, despite the political setbacks of 1381. Excavations of rural households reveal increasing use of metal tools, glass vessels, and imported goods that would have been unimaginable luxuries for pre-plague peasants. The material culture of the common people was being transformed, even as their legal status remained officially unchanged. The transformation was particularly dramatic for women. Before the plague, most peasant women had been trapped in cycles of childbearing and domestic labour, with virtually no economic independence. But the labour shortage created unprecedented opportunities for female employment in textile production, brewing, retail trade, and domestic service. For the first time in medieval history, ordinary women could earn enough money to support themselves without depending on fathers or husbands. Some chose to delay marriage or remain single entirely, using their economic independence to make choices about their own lives that previous generations of women could never have contemplated. This female economic empowerment had ripple effects throughout society. Traditional marriage patterns began to change as women gained the ability to be selective about potential husbands. Birth rates started to decline as women chose to have fewer children and focus more energy on economic activities. Even clothing styles evolved as working women demanded more practical garments that allowed them to move freely and work efficiently. The nobility watched these changes with growing alarm and confusion. The social order that had seemed so stable and permanent just a few decades earlier was dissolving before their eyes. Ants were dressing like merchants, women were acting like independent agents, and workers were behaving like they had actual rights and choices. Some nobles tried to adapt to the new reality by becoming more entrepreneurial themselves. Instead of simply collecting rents from traditional feudal obligations, they began to invest in new agricultural techniques manufacturing enterprises, and trade ventures that could generate the cash income they needed to compete for workers in the new economy. Others retreated into nostalgic fantasies about the good old days, when everyone knew their place and stayed in it. These reactionary nobles became obsessed with ceremony, genealogy, and elaborate displays of aristocratic privilege designed to distinguish them from the increasingly prosperous common people. But their desperate attempts to maintain social distance only highlighted how much the fundamental balance of power had shifted. The most that the OL's successful nobles were those who recognized world was gone forever and began to reinvent themselves for the new one. They learned to negotiate with their workers rather than simply commanding them. They invested in improvements that would make their estates more attractive to potential employees. They even began to adopt some of the commercial practices and entrepreneurial attitudes that had once dignity. This being beneath noble process of aristocratic adaptation was slow and often painful, but it was essential for survival in the post-plague economy. Nobles who refused to change found themselves gradually impoverished as their workers departed for better opportunities elsewhere. Those who embraced change discovered that treating workers as valuable partners rather than disposable property could actually be more profitable than the old system of exploitation. The urban economy was experiencing similar transformations. Craft guilds that had once strictly controlled who could practice various trades found themselves forced to relax their restrictions in order to meet the demand for skilled workers. Apprenticeship programs that had traditionally taken 7 years were compressed into 3 or 4. Master craftsmen who had once jealously guarded their trade secrets began training workers more quickly and efficiently. Cities that had been rigidly hierarchical became more fluid and dynamic. Social mobility increased dramatically as talented individuals found opportunities that would have been closed to them in the pre-plague world. Merchant families that had been excluded from political power began to challenge the traditional urban aristocracies. Working-class neighborhoods that had been ignored by city governments began to demand representation and services. The intellectual and cultural changes were just as profound as the economic ones. Universities that had once been exclusively for the clergy and nobility began to admit students from merchant and artisan families. Books that had once been rare and expensive became more widely available as the demand for literacy increased among the rising commercial classes. New ideas about politics, religion, and social organization began to circulate more freely. The rebellion of 1381 had failed to achieve its immediate goals, but it had demonstrated that fundamental change was possible. Thinkers and writers began to explore concepts of popular sovereignty, individual rights, and social contracts that would have been unthinkable in the rigid hierarchy of pre-plague society. The long-term impact of these changes would not become fully apparent for generations. But by the early 15th century, it was clear that the Black Death had accomplished something that centuries of peasant suffering and noble oppression had never achieved. It had broken the back of feudalism and created the economic and social foundations for a more modern, dynamic, and ultimately more democratic society. The serfs who had survived the plague hadn't just become rebels for a few dramatic days in 1381. They had become the ancestors of a new kind of society where ordinary people had real economic power, genuine social mobility, and the beginnings of political influence that would eventually grow into modern democracy. The Black Death had indeed given power to the poor, not through any conscious design or benevolent intention, but through the brutal logic of supply and demand. When there weren't enough workers to go around, workers valuable. When workers became valuable, they gained leverage. And when they gained leverage, they began to reshape the world in ways that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors who had lived and died as powerless serfs in the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe. The transformation wasn't complete, and it wasn't without setbacks and reversals. But the fundamental shift in the balance of power between rich and poor, between rulers and ruled, between the privileged few and the common many, had begun. And once begun, it would prove impossible to stop entirely, no matter how many rebellions were crushed or how many royal decrees were issued in defense of the old order. The plague had killed 1/3 of Europe's population, but it had given birth to something entirely new: the idea that ordinary people deserve dignity, opportunity, and a voice in determining their own fate. That idea, born in the ashes of medieval certainty, would continue to grow and spread until it eventually transformed not just Europe, but the entire world. The revolution that began with the Black Death didn't end with Wat Tyler's blood soaking into the dirt at Smithfield. In fact, what happened next might be even more remarkable than the dramatic uprising itself, because while the rebels had lost their battle, they were about to win something much more important: the war for the future of European society. Picture yourself as a village blacksmith in the autumn of 1381, just months after the rebellion's brutal suppression. The royal commissioners have come and gone, hanging the local leaders and burning the charters that promised freedom. Your lord is back to making the same old demands about feudal obligations and traditional services. On the surface, it looks like nothing has changed. But then a messenger arrives from the next village over. They're offering you double wages to come set up shop there. Their old blacksmith died in the plague years, and they're desperate for someone with 5 pack up your tools, your skills. You could walk miles down the road and instantly double your income while escaping the lord who's been making your life miserable. This is the moment when you realize that the real revolution wasn't the dramatic march on London or the confrontation with the king. The real revolution was economic, and it was happening quietly, village by village, workshop by workshop, one individual decision at a time. Because here's what the nobles and their royal commissioners couldn't understand. You can't execute a labour shortage. You can hang rebel leaders, burn radical sermons, and revoke royal charters. But you can't bring back the millions of workers who died in the plague years. And without those workers, all the laws and threats and traditional obligations in the world become meaningless pieces of parchment. The blacksmith in our story represents millions of survivors who discovered they had something their ancestors never possessed: choice. For the first time in medieval history, ordinary workers could shop around for better deals. They could negotiate terms. They could walk away from bad situations knowing that someone else would hire them immediately. And walk away they did, in numbers that terrified the established order. Court records from across England show a massive spike in prosecutions for illegal departure in the years following 1381. Lords were constantly hauling workers before magistrates, demanding that runaways be returned to their traditional obligations. But the legal system was overwhelmed, and more importantly, it was fighting against economic, the case of William Reality. Take Miller from a small village in Yorkshire. In 1382, his lord sued him for abandoning his hereditary position as the manor's grain miller without permission. The court ruled and ordered William to return immediately the lord's favour But when the bailiffs went to enforce the judgment, they found that William had already been hired by 3 different lords, each offering better terms than his original master. Which lord should get William's services? The one who claimed hereditary rights over his labour, or the one offering the highest wages and best working conditions? The legal system said one thing, but economic logic said another. And increasingly, economic logic was winning logic. This individual drama played out thousands of times across Europe as the economic transformation accelerated beyond anyone's ability to control it. The plague had created a new kind of economy where workers were scarce and valuable, and no amount of legislation could change that fundamental reality. But the transformation went far deeper than simple wage negotiations. The plague had shattered the psychological foundations of medieval society just as thoroughly as it had disrupted the economic ones. The generation that survived the Great Dying had lived through the end of the world and discovered that life went on. Nothing seemed permanent anymore. Nothing seemed sacred or unchangeable. Consider what it meant to be a young person coming of age in this transformed world. Your grandparents had lived their entire lives believing that social hierarchy was divinely ordained and absolutely fixed. They had accepted poverty, servitude, and oppression as natural parts of God's plan. But you had grown up hearing stories about the time when peasants controlled London, when workers dictated terms to kings, when ordinary people had proved that the mighty could be brought low. These stories didn't just entertain, they educated. They taught young workers that authority was fragile, that resistance was possible, and that change could happen faster than anyone imagined. The rebellion of 1381 might have been defeated, but its memory became a kind of hidden curriculum that spread through villages and workshops, teaching practical lessons about power and possibility. The church struggled desperately to combat this new consciousness. Priests delivered sermon after sermon about the wickedness of social ambition and the holiness of accepting one's divinely appointed station. But their congregations could see with their own eyes that the supposedly divine social order was crumbling. When the village serf was earning more than the village priest, traditional theology started to sound less convincing. Some clergymen began to adapt their message to the new reality. Instead of preaching absolute submission to earthly authority, they emphasized God's love for all people regardless of social status. Instead of condemning material improvement as sinful greed, they praised honest labor and fair wages as expressions of divine justice. This theological evolution was particularly important for women, who found themselves with unprecedented economic opportunities in the post-plague world. Traditional Christian teaching had emphasized female submission and domestic confinement, but now women were working as independent brewers, textile producers, and merchants. The church gradually developed new interpretations that could accommodate these economic realities without completely abandoning traditional doctrine. The legal system faced similar pressures to evolve or become irrelevant. Medieval law had been designed for a world where everyone stayed in their assigned place and accepted their inherited status. But that world no longer existed. Courts found themselves dealing with contract disputes between parties who would never have been able to enter into contracts in the old system. They handled property transactions involving people who had never been allowed to own property before. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the law began to recognize new kinds of rights and relationships. Wage labor contracts became legally enforceable, even when they violated traditional feudal obligations. Property ownership expanded beyond the narrow circle of noble families. Personal mobility became a recognized legal principle rather than a criminal act. These changes happened piecemeal, case by case, without any grand proclamation or revolutionary manifesto. But their cumulative effect was to create a legal framework that could accommodate the new economic and social realities that the plague had created. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the cities, where the breakdown of traditional hierarchies created space for new kinds of social organization. Urban guilds that had once been rigidly exclusive began admitting members from previously excluded groups. City governments that had once been controlled by hereditary elites found themselves negotiating with representatives of working-class neighborhoods. The physical appearance of cities changed too. Wealthy merchants built grand houses that rivaled noble palaces. Skilled craftsmen constructed workshops that doubled as retail. Even establishments ordinary laborers could afford better housing, clothing, and food than their predecessors had ever imagined possible. These material improvements weren't just about comfort or status. They represented a fundamental shift in how people understood their place in the world. When a carpenter could afford to dress as well as a minor noble, when a weaver could own books and send her children to school, when a farmer could save enough money to buy his own land, the old certainties about fixed social hierarchy became impossible to maintain. The nobility watched these changes with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. Some tried to retreat into increasingly elaborate displays of aristocratic privilege, hoping to maintain social distance through ceremony and spectacle. They developed complex codes of dress, behavior, and speech designed to distinguish themselves from the rising commercial classes. But these efforts often backfired by making the nobility seem ridiculous rather than impressive. When common workers could afford silk and spices, noble insistence on wearing ermine and gold looked less like natural superiority and more like desperate posturing. The gap between aristocratic pretensions and economic reality became a source of popular entertainment rather than reverent awe. More successful nobles learned to adapt by becoming entrepreneurs themselves. Instead of relying solely on feudal rents and traditional obligations, they invested in new agricultural techniques, manufacturing ventures, and trade enterprises. Some discovered that treating workers as valuable partners rather than disposable property was actually more profitable than the old system of exploitation. The agricultural revolution that followed was perhaps the most important long-term consequence of the plague's demographic impact. With fewer workers available, landowners had to find ways to make agriculture more efficient and productive. They invested in better tools, improved breeding techniques for livestock, and more scientific approaches to crop rotation and soil management. These innovations increased productivity per worker, which made it possible to pay higher wages while still maintaining profitability. The result was a virtuous cycle where better technology led to higher wages, which attracted better workers, which justified further investment in technology. The enclosure movement, which would eventually transform English agriculture, had its roots in this post-plague search for efficiency. Landowners discovered that consolidating small scattered strips into larger unified fields could dramatically increase productivity. But unlike the later enclosures that would dispossess small farmers, these early consolidations often benefited workers by creating more stable, higher-paying employment. Rural England began to look different as hedgerows divided the landscape into the patchwork pattern that would become characteristic of the English countryside. Villages grew more prosperous as agricultural efficiency increased. Market towns expanded as improved transportation networks made it easier to move goods and people across longer distances. The demographic impact of the plague also created opportunities for geographic mobility that had been impossible in the overcrowded pre-plague world. Entire regions that had been densely settled were now relatively empty, with abandoned farmland waiting for new settlers. Young people who might have been trapped in their birth villages for life could now migrate to areas offering better opportunities. This internal migration helped spread the social and economic changes that had begun in the immediate aftermath of the plague. Workers who had learned to negotiate and assert themselves in one region carried those skills and attitudes to new areas. Ideas about fair wages, decent working conditions, and personal freedom spread along the same routes that people used to seek better opportunities. The cumulative effect was to create a more integrated and dynamic society where information, people, and innovations could flow more freely than ever before. The rigid localism of medieval life gave way to broader networks of communication and exchange that would eventually span entire continents. International trade also expanded as the improved economic conditions in post-plague Europe created demand for luxury goods and raw materials from distant lands. Merchants who had once served only narrow aristocratic markets discovered that prosperous workers could be valuable customers too. The spice trade, silk production, and other luxury industries found new markets among the rising middle classes that the plague had helped create. These commercial networks carried more than just goods. They also transmitted ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations that would help drive further social change. The printing press, when it arrived in the later 15th century, found a ready market among the increasingly literate populations that post-plague prosperity had made possible. The intellectual revolution of the Renaissance had its roots in the social upheaval that followed the Black Death. When traditional authorities lost their credibility and new social groups gained economic power, space opened up for different ways of thinking about nature. Politics, religion, and human universities that had once been exclusively for training clergy began admitting students from merchant and artisan families. These new students brought different perspectives and asked different questions than their aristocratic predecessors. They were more interested in practical knowledge that could advance their careers than in abstract theology that justified existing hierarchies. The humanist movement, with its emphasis on individual dignity and potential, appealed particularly to the rising commercial classes who had used their own talents and efforts to improve their social position. The idea that human beings could shape their own destiny through education and hard work resonated with people who had actually experienced social mobility in their own lives. Even artistic production was transformed as new patrons emerged to challenge the traditional dominance of church and aristocratic sponsors. Wealthy merchants commissioned works that celebrated commercial success and urban life rather than feudal glory or religious devotion. Artists found they could make a living serving a broader market rather than depending on the favor of a few powerful patrons. The long-term political implications were just as revolutionary as the immediate economic and social changes. The idea that ordinary people deserved a voice in government gained credibility as workers demonstrated their economic importance and organizational capability. Representative institutions that had once been dominated by nobles and clergy began to include merchants, craftsmen, and even prosperous farmers. The English Parliament that emerged from the medieval period was fundamentally different from its pre-plague predecessor, not just in its membership, but in its understanding of its role and responsibilities. The House of Commons became a real political force, rather than a ceremonial appendage to aristocratic power. Similar changes occurred across Europe as traditional feudal assemblies evolved into more representative institutions. The economic leverage that workers had gained through demographic change gradually translated into political influence that would shape the development of European government for centuries to come. The religious reformation of the 16th century also had its roots in the social upheaval that followed the plague. When traditional church authority lost credibility and new social groups gained confidence, the stage was set for religious as well as political revolution. The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and direct relationship with God appealed particularly to the rising commercial classes who had learned to think for themselves in economic matters. But perhaps the most important legacy of the post-plague transformation was psychological rather than institutional. The generation that lived through the Great Dying and its aftermath had learned that change was possible, that authority was fallible, and that ordinary people could shape their own destiny through collective action. This new consciousness would inspire future movements for social justice, political reform, and economic equality throughout European history. The peasants who had briefly controlled London in 1381 became ancestors, not just to English democrats and reformers, but to revolutionaries and activists across the world who would draw inspiration from their example. The Black Death had ended the medieval world, not through conquest or ideology, but through the simple demographic fact of mass mortality. But what emerged from that catastrophe was something genuinely new, a society where ordinary people had real power, genuine opportunities, and the confidence to believe that they deserved both. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Centuries would pass before the full implications became apparent. There would be setbacks, reversals, and periods when it seemed like the old order might reassert itself. But the fundamental shift in the balance of power between rich and poor, between rulers and ruled, had begun and would prove impossible to reverse entirely. By the time the medieval period ended, Europe had become a fundamentally different kind of society than it had been before the plague arrived. It was more dynamic, more egalitarian, more responsive to the needs and aspirations of ordinary people. The rigid hierarchies that had once seemed divinely ordained and eternally fixed had given way to more fluid arrangements where talent, effort, and luck could overcome the circumstances of birth. The serfs who had survived the Black Death hadn't just become rebels for a few dramatic days. They had become the founders of a new kind of civilization where ordinary people mattered, where workers had rights, and where the idea of human equality was no longer unthinkable heresy, but practical reality. The plague that killed 1/3 of Europe's population had given birth to the modern world, and at its heart was a simple but revolutionary idea that common people deserved uncommon opportunities, and that a society that failed to provide them would face the consequences of their justified anger. That lesson, written in the blood and suffering of the 14th century, would echo through history as a permanent reminder that true power ultimately rests with those who do the work that keeps civilization running. The Black Death had indeed given power to the poor, but more than that, it had taught them how to use it. But as we reach the end of the 14th century, let's zoom out and look at what had really happened. Because what we're witnessing isn't just the story of one pandemic or one rebellion. We're watching the birth pangs of the modern world, delivered by death itself in ways that no one could have predicted or planned. Think about it this way. In 1347, if you had told a medieval lord that within 50 years his serfs would be negotiating wages, buying their own land, and sending their children to school, he would have laughed you out of his castle. If you had suggested that peasants would one day storm the capital and force kings to negotiate, he would have called you mad. And if you had predicted that the rigid social hierarchy blessed by God himself would crumble into something resembling economic equality, he would have had you burned as a heretic. Yet all of these impossible things had come to pass, not through divine intervention or philosophical enlightenment, but through the brutal arithmetic of demographic collapse. When death removed 1/3 of the workforce, the survivors inherited a world where their labor was suddenly precious beyond measure. The transformation rippled outward in ways that are still shaping our world today. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, surviving peasants discovered they could demand better wages. Within a generation, their children were learning to read and write. Within 2 generations, their grandchildren were establishing businesses, buying property, and challenging the political monopoly of the traditional elite. This wasn't gradual evolution. This, into a few, was revolutionary change compressed decades of social upheaval that remade European civilization from the ground up. The feudal world of rigid hierarchy and hereditary servitude gave way to something far more fluid and dynamic, where talent and ambition could overcome the accidents of birth. Consider what this meant for human potential. Before the plague, 90% of Europe's population lived and died as serfs, their talents wasted in grinding poverty and ignorance. Brilliant minds that could have become inventors, artists, or scholars instead spent their lives hauling water and mucking out stables because that was their divinely appointed role in society. But after the plague, those same kinds of minds found opportunities that had never existed before. The daughter of a serf could become a successful textile merchant. The son of a peasant could learn to read and become a clerk or accountant. Entire families could climb from the bottom of society to something approaching middle-class prosperity within a single lifetime. This unleashing of human potential had consequences that went far beyond individual success stories. When more people had access to education, literacy rates increased dramatically. When more people had disposable income, markets expanded and innovation accelerated. When more people had a stake in society, political participation became broader and more representative. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, even the eventual development of democratic government, all of these transformations had their roots in the social upheaval that followed the Black Death. When the rigid structures of medieval society collapsed, space opened up for new ways of thinking about everything from art and religion to politics and natural philosophy. But perhaps the most important legacy was psychological. The generation that survived the plague had learned that change was not only possible, but inevitable. They had watched the seemingly permanent structures of medieval life collapse in a matter of years. They had seen divine authority revealed as human convention. They had discovered that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they acted together. This new consciousness became embedded in European culture in ways that would prove impossible to eradicate. Even when political reaction tried to restore the old order, even when economic downturns temporarily weakened worker bargaining power, the memory remained. People had tasted freedom and equality, and they would not forget what it felt like. The rebellions that followed, from the German Peasants' War to the English Civil War to the French Revolution, all drew inspiration from that original moment when death had accidentally liberated the living. Each generation of rebels and reformers looked back to the precedent of 1381, when common people had briefly held the power to reshape their world. And here's what makes this story so remarkable. The Black Death didn't set out to create social justice or economic equality. It was simply a disease doing what diseases do, spreading, killing, and moving on. But its unintended consequences were more revolutionary than any political movement or religious crusade had ever achieved. By removing so many people from the bottom of the social pyramid, the plague had fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval society. The survivors didn't just inherit empty villages and abandoned farms. They inherited leverage, opportunity, and for the first time in centuries, genuine hope for a better future. The irony is almost too perfect. Death, the great destroyer, had become the great liberator. The apocalypse that seemed to signal the end of the world had actually marked the beginning of a new one. The disaster that medieval people interpreted as divine punishment had turned out to be divine gift, though not in any way they could have understood at the time. As we look back across the centuries, we can see the long arc of progress that began in those plague-ravaged villages of the 14th century. The idea that ordinary people deserve dignity, opportunity, and a voice in their own governance, ideas so fundamental to our modern world that we take them for granted, had their birth in the desperate negotiations between desperate lords and suddenly valuable peasants. The workers who survived the Black Death didn't just escape serfdom. They escaped the entire medieval worldview that had justified serfdom as natural and inevitable. They proved that social structures were human creations that could be changed by human action. They demonstrated that power ultimately belonged to those who did the essential work of keeping society functioning. That lesson echoes through history, right up to our present moment. Every time workers organize for better conditions, every time ordinary people challenge elite power, every time someone insists that human dignity doesn't depend on accident of birth, they are continuing a conversation that began in the aftermath of the Black Death. The plague that killed 30 million people had given birth to ideas that would eventually touch billions. The catastrophe that seemed to signal civilization's end had actually planted the seeds of its rebirth on more just and equitable foundations. So the next time you hear someone say that meaningful change is impossible, that the powerful will always exploit the powerless, that ordinary people can't make a difference in the grand sweep of history, remember the story of how the Black Death accidentally created the first great workers' revolution. Remember that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from careful planning or noble intentions, but from the simple fact that when circumstances change dramatically enough, everything becomes possible. Remember that the serfs who survived the plague didn't set out to overthrow the feudal system. They just wanted fair wages and decent treatment, but their individual acts of resistance added up to a revolution that changed the course of human history. And remember that the power they discovered, the power of ordinary people to reshape their world when they act together, didn't die with them. It passed down through generations, inspiring every movement for justice and equality that followed. The Black Death may have ended 7 centuries ago, but the revolution it started is still unfolding today. The peasants had become rebels, the serfs had become citizens, and the powerless had discovered that they were, in fact, the most powerful force in human society. All it took was a pandemic, to remind everyone that civilization depends entirely on the people who grow the food, make the goods, and do the essential work that keeps the world running. When those people finally realized their own worth, nothing was ever the same again. The Black Death had given power to the poor, and they had used it to build a better world for everyone who came after. That might be the most hopeful story in all of human history. But the story doesn't end with hope and progress, because there's a darker side to this transformation that we need to talk about. The same demographic collapse that empowered workers in Western Europe had exactly the opposite effect in the lands further east. And understanding why reveals something crucial about how power really works in human societies. Picture yourself as a peasant in Poland or Hungary around 1400, 50 years after the plague had finished its work. You've heard stories, maybe from travelling merchants or wandering priests, about the miraculous changes happening in England and France. Tales of peasants who negotiate their own wages, of serfs who own their own land, of common workers who dress like minor nobles and send their children to school. But when you look around your own village, none of that seems remotely possible. If anything, conditions have gotten worse since the plague years. Your Lord has more power over your life than ever before. The legal restrictions that bind you to the land have become tighter, not looser. And the idea of walking away to find better work elsewhere, that's not just discouraged. It's become literally impossible. What happened in Eastern Europe reveals Black Death's the dirty secret about theating effects. The plague didn't automatically create freedom and equality wherever it struck. It created opportunity for freedom, but only in places where other conditions were already favourable to change. Where those conditions didn't exist, the same demographic collapse that freed Western European peasants actually made Eastern European serfs more oppressed than ever. The key difference was political structure. In England and France, royal power had been growing stronger for centuries, gradually weakening the ability of individual lords to control their territories independently. Kings wanted unified legal systems, standardized currencies, and the ability to tax everyone directly, rather than working through layers of feudal hierarchy. This centralization meant that when the plague struck and workers became scarce, no single lord could simply forbid his peasants from leaving. If one estate offered better conditions than another, workers could actually move. Royal courts would enforce their contracts. Royal roads would protect their travel. The power of individual nobles to trap workers in hereditary bondage was being eroded by forces much larger than any local manor. But in Eastern Europe, political fragmentation meant that local lords retained almost absolute power over their territories. When the plague created labour shortages, these lords didn't compete with each other by offering better wages and conditions. Instead, they collaborated to prevent any worker mobility at all. They created legal barriers that made it impossible for peasants to leave their home estates. They established mutual agreements to return runaway serfs to their original masters. The result was something historians call the second serfdom, a system even more restrictive than medieval feudalism had been. Eastern European peasants found themselves legally bound, not just to specific pieces of land, but to specific lords who now had unprecedented power over their lives. Marriage required permission, travel required documentation. Even the most basic economic decisions were subject to noble approval. Think about what this meant in human terms. While English peasants were learning to read and accumulating small fortunes, Polish leave their villages without peasants were being forbidden to written passes. While French workers were buying their own tools and negotiating seasonal contracts, Hungarian serfs were being sold along with the land they worked like pieces of farm equipment. The demographic opportunity that the plague had created was captured entirely by the existing power structure rather than filtering down to benefit ordinary workers. Lords who had lost half their labour force didn't respond by treating the survivors better. They responded by making it impossible for the survivors to escape. This divergence between Western and Eastern Europe would shape the continent's development for centuries to come. The regions where workers gained power after the plague became the birthplaces of capitalism, democracy, and individual rights. The regions where lords tightened their control became economic backwaters that lagged behind in almost every measure of human development. But even in Western Europe, the gains were fragile and constantly under threat. The prosperity and freedom that plague survivors had achieved could be lost just as quickly as it had been gained. And by the late 15th century, new challenges were emerging that would test whether the post-plague transformation could survive and spread. The most immediate threat came from population recovery. By 1500, Europe's population had finally returned to pre-plague levels. The demographic advantage that had given workers so much leverage was disappearing as new generations filled the empty villages and abandoned farms. Supply and demand was shifting back toward the old pattern where there were more workers than jobs. Some regions saw immediate reversals. Wages fell as competition for employment increased. Lords who had been forced to negotiate with their workers for decades suddenly found themselves in a position to dictate terms again. Legal restrictions that had been impossible to enforce during the labour shortage were dusted off and reapplied. The enclosure movement in England provides a perfect example of how quickly things could change. During the immediate post-plague period, landowners had been desperate to attract and retain workers, offering them secure tenure and reasonable rents on good agricultural land. But as population pressure returned, these same landowners discovered they could make more money by converting their fields to pasture for sheep and wool production. Entire villages were depopulated as lords evicted their tenants to make room for livestock. Families that had lived on the same land for generations found themselves homeless and jobless overnight. The security that workers had gained during the plague years evaporated as economic conditions shifted against them once again. The response was immediate and desperate. A new wave of rebellions swept across Europe as workers fought to preserve the gains they had made. But these uprisings were different from the plague-era revolts. They were defensive rather than offensive, trying to hold on to something that was slipping away rather than demanding something new. The German Peasants' War of 1524 was perhaps the largest of these defensive rebellions. Over 300,000 peasants took up arms across the Holy Roman Empire, demanding that the freedoms they had gained after the plague be preserved and expanded rather than rolled back. Their manifesto, known as the 12 Articles, reads like a desperate plea to maintain the social progress that demographic change had made possible. But the German peasants faced a problem that their predecessors in 1381 hadn't encountered. The political and military balance of power had shifted decisively against popular movements. Professional armies equipped with gunpowder weapons could now crush peasant militias with devastating efficiency. The castle walls that had once protected lords from angry villagers were obsolete, but the new military technology gave rulers even more effective tools for controlling their populations. The German Peasants' War ended in catastrophic defeat. Over 100,000 rebels were killed in battles and executions that followed. The survivors found themselves facing even harsher restrictions than they had been fighting against. The lesson was clear. The window of opportunity that the plague had opened was closing, and trying to force it back open through violence was likely to backfire. But here's what's fascinating about this period. Even as some gains were being reversed, others were becoming permanently embedded in European society. The economic and cultural changes that had followed the plague proved more durable than the immediate political victories. Literacy rates that had risen during the post-plague prosperity didn't fall back to medieval levels. Commercial practices that had developed to serve newly prosperous workers didn't disappear when wages declined. Urban institutions that had emerged to represent broader social groups didn't simply dissolve when political reactions set in. Most importantly, the ideas about human dignity and social possibility that had emerged from the plague experience couldn't be unlearned. Even when specific freedoms were taken away, people retained the knowledge that change was possible and that ordinary individuals could shape their own destiny through collective action. The Protestant Reformation provides a perfect example of how these deeper changes continued to unfold, even when surface conditions seemed to be moving backward. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, he was building on intellectual and social foundations that had been laid during the post-plague transformation. The idea that individuals could have a direct relationship with God without clerical mediation appealed particularly to the commercial classes who had learned to think independently about economic matters. The concept that religious truth could be found through personal Bible study rather than institutional authority resonated with people who had already challenged traditional hierarchies in secular contexts. The printing press that spread Luther's ideas so rapidly had found its market among the increasingly literate populations that post-plague prosperity had created. The economic networks that funded Protestant and schools churches had been built by merchants and craftsmen whose families had risen from serfdom during the demographic transition. Even the political support for religious reform came largely from rulers who wanted to break free from the same kin constraints that peased of traditional ants had been challenging for generations. The struggle between emperor and prince, between pope and king, between established authority and emerging alternatives, followed patterns that had been established during the great social upheavals of the 14th century. The wars of religion that tore Europe apart during the 16th century were, in many ways, the final phase of the revolution that had begun with the Black Death. They represented the working out of conflicts between old and new ways of organizing society that had been set in motion by demographic collapse and social transformation. But by the time these wars ended in exhaustion during the early 17th century, the basic outlines of the modern world had become clear. Europe was no longer a feudal society of rigid hierarchy and hereditary bondage. It had become something messier but more dynamic, where multiple centers of power competed for influence and ordinary people had genuine, if limited, opportunities to shape their own fate. The peasants who had briefly controlled London in 1381 were long dead, but their descendants were living in a world that bore their influence. Not the world they had demanded in their negotiations with King Richard II, but something that carried forward the essential spirit of their rebellion. The idea that common people deserved uncommon opportunities. The transformation wasn't complete, and it wasn't evenly distributed. Women still faced legal restrictions that limited their economic and political participation. Religious minorities were persecuted. Slavery was expanding in the colonial world, even as serfdom was disappearing in Europe. The benefits of social change were still concentrated among certain groups, while others remained excluded. But the precedent had been established, and the mechanisms had been created for future expansion of rights and opportunities. The same economic forces that had empowered European peasants after the plague would eventually empower other groups in contexts other. The same organizational methods that had made peasant rebellion possible would be adapted and refined by later movements for social change. The intellectual frameworks that had emerged from the post-plague experience about individual ideas' worth, collective action, and the possibility of social transformation would provide inspiration for movements across the globe. The revolution that had begun in the aftermath of demographic catastrophe would continue to unfold across centuries and continents. By the dawn of the 18th century, visitors to Europe could see the legacy of the Black Death everywhere they looked, even if they didn't recognize it as such. In the bustling commercial cities, where merchants and craftsmen had gained political influence. In the countryside, where prosperous farmers owned their own land and sent their children to school. In the universities, where students from modest backgrounds could pursue careers in law, medicine, and government service. Most of all, they could see it in the attitudes and expectations of ordinary people who had learned to believe that they deserved better treatment than their ancestors had received. The deference and resignation that had characterized medieval peasant culture had given way to something more assertive and confident. This psychological transformation may have been the most important legacy of all. Because once people learn that change is possible, once they discover that their own actions can reshape the world around them, that knowledge becomes part of their cultural inheritance. It gets passed down through families and communities in stories, songs, and shared memories that preserve the essential lesson even when specific details are forgotten. The Black Death had taught European society that no social arrangement was permanent, that no hierarchy was unshakable, that no tradition was so sacred that it couldn't be challenged when circumstances demanded change. That lesson would echo through the centuries, inspiring each new generation of reformers and revolutionaries who sought to build a more just and equitable world. The serfs had indeed become rebels, but more than that, they had become the ancestors of everyone who would ever fight for dignity, opportunity, and justice in the centuries that followed. Their brief moment of power in the 14th century had planted seeds that would continue to sprout and grow, reshaping human society in ways that would have seemed impossible to imagine when the first plague ships arrived in European ports. The Great Dying was over, but the great transformation it had set in motion was just beginning. And 600 years later, we're still living in the world that emerged from the ashes of medieval certainty, still working out the implications of the revolution that death itself had accidentally started. The plague that had killed 30 million people hadn't just given power to the poor. It had given them something even more valuable: the knowledge that power could be taken, held, and used to build something better. That knowledge, once gained, could never be completely lost. It had become part of the human story, a permanent reminder that even the most overwhelming catastrophe could become the foundation for unprecedented opportunity. And that, perhaps, is the most hopeful lesson we can draw from this strange and terrible chapter of human history. Not that death brings freedom, but that human beings have an extraordinary capacity to find possibility in the midst of catastrophe, to discover opportunity in the heart of disaster, and to build something better from the ruins of what came before. The Black Death had ended, but the revolution it started was eternal. But what if I told you that this story has a twist ending that nobody saw coming? Because while we've been following the dramatic rise and fall of peasant power in medieval Europe, something else was happening quietly in the background. Something that would ensure the real victory wasn't measured in battles won or charters signed, but in the slow, relentless transformation of human consciousness itself. Picture this scene from a village in Kent, sometime around 1420. An old man sits by his fireplace, telling his grandson about the time he marched with Wat Tyler to London. The boy listens with wide eyes as his grandfather describes the moment when peasants controlled the capital, when kings negotiated with common workers, when the impossible became reality for just a few shining days. But here's what makes this scene so powerful. The old man isn't just telling a story about the past. He's planting an idea in the mind of the future. That young boy will grow up knowing that ordinary people once held extraordinary power. He'll pass that knowledge to his own children, and they'll pass it to theirs. The memory of revolution becomes a kind of inheritance, more valuable than land or gold, because it carries the possibility of change. This is how real transformation happens, not through dramatic battles or royal decrees, but through the gradual accumulation of shared knowledge about what's possible when people act together. The rebellion of 1381 had lasted only a few weeks, but its psychological impact would last for centuries. Let's follow the ripple effects as they spread outward through European society. In the decades following Tyler's death, you start to see something remarkable happening in villages across England. Workers who had never heard of formal contracts began writing down agreements with their employers. Peasants who had never questioned traditional authority started demanding written proof of their rights and obligations. This wasn't just economic negotiation. This was the birth of legal consciousness among people who had previously been excluded from the legal system entirely. When a village blacksmith insists on a written contract specifying his wages and working conditions, he's not just protecting his own interests. He's asserting that his labor has value, that his agreements have meaning, and that his word carries weight in the broader community. The church records from this period tell a fascinating story about how these changes played out at the most local level. Parish priests found themselves mediating disputes between workers and employers with increasing frequency. These weren't the traditional conflicts between lord and serf that had defined medieval rural life. These were commercial disagreements between parties who saw themselves as equals in the eyes of God and the law. Think about what this meant for someone like Alice the alewife, a widow who brewed beer for her village market. Before the plague, Alice would have been completely dependent on her lord's permission to operate her business. She would have paid him a percentage of her profits, accepted whatever price he set for her raw materials, and hoped he wouldn't decide to give her monopoly to someone else. But in the post-plague world, Alice had options. She could negotiate directly with barley farmers for better prices on grain. She could set her own beer prices based on what the market would bear. She could even refuse to serve customers who didn't treat her with respect. For the first time in her life, Alice was running a business rather than just performing a service. Multiply this story by thousands of similar cases across Europe, and you begin to see how the plague had created something unprecedented. A commercial middle class that existed between the traditional extremes of noble wealth and peasant poverty. These weren't people who had inherited status or accumulated vast fortunes. They were ordinary workers who had used their post-plague leverage to build small but independent economic enterprises. The urban transformation was even more dramatic. Cities that had been rigidly controlled by hereditary merchant guilds found themselves forced to accommodate new kinds of businesses and new types of entrepreneurs. A master carpenter who had once been limited to working for established guild members could now set up his own workshop and compete directly for customers. Take the case of Thomas Wright, a skilled stoneworker who had learned his trade as an apprentice before the plague struck. In the old world, Thomas would have spent decades working his way up through guild hierarchy, paying dues and following rules set by men whose main qualification was being born into merchant families. But the post-plague labour shortage changed everything. Churches needed rebuilding, wealthy merchants wanted grander houses, and there simply weren't enough established craftsmen to meet the demand. Thomas could skip the traditional guild apprenticeship entirely, set up his own business, and charge premium prices for his skills. More importantly, Thomas could train his own apprentices according to his own methods, rather than following guild traditions that had remained unchanged for generations. This created a kind of technological acceleration as practical innovations spread more quickly through networks of independent craftsmen than they had through rigid institutional hierarchies. The intellectual changes were just as profound as the economic ones. Libraries that had once been exclusively for clergy began acquiring books on practical subjects like agriculture, commerce and engineering. Universities that had focused entirely on theology and classical learning started offering courses that would actually be useful for the rising commercial classes. But perhaps the most significant development was the spread of literacy among people who would never have learned to read in the pre-plague world. When a successful brewster like Alice needed to keep track of her customers and suppliers, when a craftsman like Thomas had to maintain records of his contracts and payments, basic reading and writing skills became economic necessities rather than aristocratic luxuries. This wasn't just individual advancement. This was the democratization of knowledge itself. Information that had once been hoarded by a tiny, educated elite became accessible to anyone with the motivation and opportunity to learn. The printing press, when it arrived in the late 15th century, found a ready market among these newly literate middle classes who were hungry for practical information about everything from farming techniques to foreign trade. The religious implications were equally revolutionary. When ordinary people could read the Bible for themselves, they discovered that many of the church teachings they had accepted without question weren't actually supported by Scripture. The radical theology that John Ball had preached during the Peasant Rebellion found new audiences among literate workers who could verify his interpretations for themselves. This grassroots religious reformation began decades before Martin Luther posted his famous theses. In villages across Europe, parish priests found themselves facing congregations that were no longer willing to accept theological authority without question. Lay people began forming study groups to discuss religious texts, organizing charitable activities independent of church hierarchy, and even questioning the moral authority of clergy who lived in luxury while preaching poverty to others. The political awakening was perhaps the most dramatic of all. Workers who had learned to negotiate with employers, organize collective action, and assert their legal rights in commercial contexts began applying the same skills to political situations. Local assemblies that had once been dominated by nobles and clergy found themselves including representatives from craft guilds, merchant associations, and even agricultural workers. These weren't grand constitutional conventions or revolutionary parliaments. They were practical governing bodies dealing with mundane issues like road maintenance, market regulations, and tax collection. But they represented something unprecedented in European history. Ordinary working people participating directly in the political decisions that affected their daily lives. The transformation was particularly visible in England, where the House of Commons gradually evolved from a ceremonial body that rubber-stamped noble decisions into a genuine political force that could challenge royal authority. The merchants, lawyers, and prosperous farmers who increasingly dominated Commons seats brought a different perspective than the aristocrats who controlled the House of Lords. These representatives understood commerce because they practiced it. They knew about working conditions because they had experienced them. They cared about tax policy because they paid the taxes. Their political priorities reflected the concerns of people who had to earn their living, rather than simply collecting rents from inherited estates. The international implications were just as significant. European merchants, who had gained economic independence after the plague, began establishing trade networks that bypassed traditional aristocratic controls. Instead of working through noble intermediaries who took large commissions, they dealt directly with foreign suppliers and customers. This commercial expansion wasn't just about profit. It was about information exchange on an unprecedented scale. Ideas about technology, governance, and social organization spread along the same routes that carried spices, textiles, and precious metals. A successful business practice developed in one region could be adapted and applied in completely different contexts, thousands of miles away. The colonial expansion that would reshape the global economy had its roots in this post-plague commercial revolution. When European merchants gained the capital and confidence to fund long-distance voyages, when European governments developed the administrative capacity to support overseas ventures, when European societies created the technological and organizational frameworks for managing complex international enterprises, they were building on foundations that had been laid during the social transformation that followed the Black Death. But here's what makes this story both inspiring and sobering. The same demographic collapse that had liberated European workers was about to devastate indigenous populations across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The diseases that European explorers carried to new continents would repeat the plague's demographic impact, but without its liberating social effects. Native American societies that lost 90% of their population to smallpox and other European diseases didn't experience economic empowerment and social mobility. They experienced conquest, enslavement, and cultural destruction. The demographic advantage that had given European workers leverage in their negotiations with employers became a tool of oppression when applied to colonial relationships. This contradiction reveals something crucial about how demographic change intersects with political power. The plague had empowered European peasants because they lived in societies where competing centers of authority, prevented any single group from completely controlling the survivors. But indigenous peoples, facing European colonization, had no such protection. Their demographic vulnerability was exploited rather than becoming a source of strength. The lesson is uncomfortable but important. Demographic change alone doesn't determine social outcomes. The same population collapse that creates opportunity in one context can create catastrophe in another, depending on the broader political and economic structures that shape how societies respond to crisis. Back in Europe, the long-term consequences of the post-plague transformation continue to unfold in ways that nobody could have predicted. The commercial networks that merchants had established, the legal precedents that workers had won, the educational institutions that the rising middle classes had created, all of these became building blocks for further social change. The scientific revolution of the 17th century was funded largely by merchants and professionals, whose families had risen from peasant origins during the post-plague period. The political revolutions of the 18th century drew their leadership from middle-class groups that traced their prosperity back to the demographic opportunities that had followed the Black Death. Even the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century built on social and economic foundations that had been established during the medieval transformation. The commercial law, banking systems, and labour practices that made industrial capitalism possible had their origins in the arrangements that post-plague workers had negotiated with their employers. But perhaps the most important legacy was cultural rather than institutional. The idea that ordinary people deserved dignity, opportunity, and a voice in their own governance had become embedded in European consciousness in ways that survived political setbacks and economic reversals. When the French revolutionaries proclaimed that all men were born free and equal, they were articulating principles that peasant rebels had died for 4 centuries earlier. When American colonists declared their independence based on the consent of the governed, they were applying concepts that English workers had developed during their struggles with feudal authority. The democratic ideologies that would reshape the modern world didn't emerge from abstract philosophical speculation. They grew out of the practical experience of people who had learned to organize, negotiate, and assert their collective power in the face of traditional authority. This brings us to perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The Black Death had accomplished something that centuries of peasant suffering and noble oppression had never achieved. It had broken the psychological chains that bound people to accept their inherited social position as natural and unchangeable. Once that psychological barrier was broken, once people learned that social arrangements were human creations that could be altered by human action, no amount of political reaction could completely restore the old certainties. The knowledge that change was possible became part of Europe's cultural DNA, passing from generation to generation through stories, songs, and shared memories. This is why the plague's social impact continued to reverberate long after the demographic crisis had ended. It wasn't just that workers had gained temporary leverage during a period of labour shortage. They had discovered something more fundamental about the itself nature of power. They had learned that authority depends ultimately on the consent of those who are governed, that economic systems require the cooperation of those who do the work, that social hierarchies can only survive as long as the people at the bottom are willing to accept their position. These insights, born from the desperate negotiations between plague survivors and their traditional masters, would eventually grow into the philosophical foundations of modern democracy. The peasants who had briefly controlled London in 1381 didn't just challenge feudal authority. They had discovered principles that would eventually challenge every form of authoritarian rule. The revolution that began with the Black Death was still unfolding 6 centuries later, still inspiring new movements for social justice and human dignity across the globe. The serfs had become rebels, the rebels had become citizens, and the citizens had become the agents of ongoing transformation that continues to reshape human society. So when we look back at that terrible pandemic that killed 1/3 of Europe's population, we see something more complex than simple catastrophe. We see the birth pangs of the modern world, delivered through suffering, but resulting in possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. The plague had indeed given power to the poor, but more than that, it had given them something that would prove even more valuable in the long run: the knowledge that power could be taken, held, and used to build something better. That knowledge, once gained, became immortal, passing from the medieval peasants who first discovered it to every generation that followed. And that might be the most hopeful lesson we can draw from this dark chapter of human history: that even the most overwhelming catastrophe can become the foundation for unprecedented opportunity. That human beings have an extraordinary capacity to find hope in the midst of despair, to discover strength in the face of weakness, and to build something beautiful from the ruins of what came before. The Black Death was over, but the revolution it had started would never end. Because once people learn that they have the power to change their world, they never completely forget that lesson. It becomes part of who they are, part of what they pass on to their children, part of the endless human story of struggle and hope, and the refusal to accept that things must always be as they have always been. The serfs had become rebels, but they had also become something more: the ancestors of everyone who would ever fight for dignity, justice, and the radical idea that ordinary people deserve extraordinary opportunities. Their brief moment of power in the 14th century had lit a flame that would never be completely extinguished, no matter how many times the powerful tried to snuff it out. And 600 years later, that flame still burns, still inspires, still reminds us that no matter how dark the present moment might seem, change is always possible when people find the courage to act together. The plague that had seemed like the end of the world had actually been the beginning of a new one. And we're still living in the world it created, still working out the implications of that ancient revolution, still discovering new ways to honor the memory of those long-dead peasants who first dared to believe that they deserved better. The Black Death had given the poor their power, but it had also given them something that would echo through the centuries in ways that nobody could have predicted. Because what we're witnessing here isn't just the end of one story. It's the beginning of an idea so dangerous, so revolutionary, that it would reshape human civilization itself. Let me paint you one final picture. It's the year 1450. Nearly 70 years after Wat Tyler's blood soaked into the dirt at Smithfield. An old woman named Margaret sits in her cottage in Kent, the same county where the Great Rebellion had begun. She's spinning wool by candlelight, but she's not doing it for survival. She's doing it because she owns the sheep, she owns the wool, and she owns the cottage where she works. Margaret's grandfather had been a serf, legally bound to his lord's land like a piece of farm equipment. Her father had marched with the rebels in 1381 and watched their dreams die with their leader. But Margaret had learned the most important lesson of all. Revolution wasn't about storming castles or executing archbishops. Revolution was about refusing to go back to the way things were. When the royal commissioners had come to restore the old order after Tyler's death, when the nobles had tried to force workers back into serfdom, when the church had preached about accepting your divinely appointed station, Margaret and thousands like her had simply said no. Not with swords or manifestos, but with their feet and their labour and their quiet, stubborn insistence that they deserved better. She had walked away from lords who offered starvation wages. She had learned to read so that nobody could cheat her with false contracts. She had saved every spare penny until she could buy her own small flock of sheep. And now, in her old age, she was a property owner, a businesswoman, a citizen in every way that mattered except the legal definition. But here's what makes Margaret's story so profound. She wasn't exceptional. Across Europe, in thousands of villages and market towns, similar transformations were playing out as the children and grandchildren of plague survivors built on the opportunities their ancestors had won. The demographic revolution that had begun with mass death was evolving into something far more subtle, but infinitely more powerful. The Black Death didn't just kill 30 million people, it killed the medieval world itself and gave birth to something entirely new. What began as humanity's darkest hour became the foundation for the greatest expansion of human freedom and opportunity in European history. The serfs who survived didn't just escape bondage, they escaped the entire mindset that had made bondage possible, proving once and for all that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they finally learned to use it.